that this title was a little bit confusing, some technical terms, and I hope by the end of this talk, all of these terms will be revealed. But I want to start with the first half of the title, From Sorcerer to Philosopher, because I was asked yesterday by one of our PhD stipendiates, Sebastian, whether this was a reference to Harry Potter. And it wasn't, but I realized after about 2 seconds that it was actually very, very appropriate. And if you look on your handout, I've given two images of the first Harry Potter release. And it was a very contentious matter because in the UK and in Canada, where I'm from, it was released as Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. But in the United States, it was released as Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Yoo-hoo. And so there was this big question about why the difference, and does that difference matter? What is the difference between a sorcerer and a philosopher? And this is a question that is actually very pertinent to this ancient character that I've been interested in for quite a while, named Apollonius of Tyana. And he is this character from antiquity. Tyana is in a region of Cappadocia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And he was known generally as a wanderer, a wonder worker, and an ascetic. But he was a character that had a very divided reputation. On the handout, again, I've given you kind of an example of how his reputation has been divided. On the left, kind of bottom, there's a papyrus that is part of this corpus called the Greek Magical Papyri. And it's a spell that's attributed to this character named Apollonius of Tyana. And you can read the whole thing or part of it that I've given you. But what I want to show here is that with this papyrus, Apollonius has been attributed and put in this category of magic. He's attributed or associated with this sort of magical world. On the other hand is an inscription that Brent Nongri pointed out to me. And this is a reconstructed text from what possibly was a library in ancient Rome around the 4th century. And this archaeologist discovered that in this library was a series of portraits of kind of intellectual, philosophic type people that you might expect to see in a library. And Apollonius of Tyana was one of those. And so this distinction that Apollonius has been understood as a philosopher on one hand, or in this sort of magical world on the other hand, is this kind of contested reputation that has happened for quite a number of years. I'm really interested in how this divided reputation has come about and how it's been negotiated. So the earliest instance of this negotiated reputation actually comes from a fellow named Philostratus. And Philostratus is an intellectual in the Roman Empire writing around the turn of the 3rd century. He's a sophist, and he's very concerned for Apollonius's reputation. And he writes a really big book about it, the life and times of Apollonius of Tyana, basically. And he gives this sweeping narrative of the birth of Apollonius, his youth, his travels to far off India and Egypt, where he discourses with philosophic types and explores his wisdom. He depicts his deeds and his discourses. And most importantly, he frames this story as a corrective. He says that other people who have talked about Apollonius think of him as a magician and misrepresent him as a philosophic imposter. But Philostratus's goal in writing the story is to show you that Apollonius is not a magician, he's not a sorcerer, he's not a charlatan, but he actually is a wise philosopher and this quasi-divine figure, and we need to appreciate him as such. But Philostratus's writings have been interesting to me, particularly in how he engages in this task of re-representing or representing Apollonius as a philosopher. What are the mechanisms and what are the strategies that he uses of representation? And there's one piece in particular that has caught my attention, and that is the function of letters in this story, the function of letters to kind of alter his reputation. This is interesting to me because letters and letter collections are a central piece of what the kind of research that I'm doing here at MF. Letters and letter collections had this sort of surge in popularity in the 2nd century of the Common Era, especially in the context of the Roman Empire. They were popular amongst Christian writers and Christian readers, and they were popular amongst non-Christian writers and non-Christian readers. And this surge of popularity accompanied not just this idea of letters as communication, not just something that I write to you in order to communicate, how are you doing, is your mother well, that kind of thing. But it started to be interesting in sort of a literary and an intellectual sphere. They were included in stories as a embedded feature of storytelling. They were cited as authoritative writings in some philosophic discourses, and they were sort of a thing that you could practice, and you could learn how to, you could go to school and learn how to write a letter properly as an emperor, as a philosopher. And I've been interested in asking this question is what is it about letters that allowed them to function in this sort of literary intellectual sphere? What benefits did letters have in that domain? What value does epistolarity, does letteriness add in that literary and intellectual aim? And there's a theoretical term that I've been using to think about this, and this is the term affordances, one of those complicated words in the title. The affordances is this term that I've encountered mostly in the world of book history and manuscript studies. And it is a fairly basic concept that form dictates or enables use. So Liv and I were talking about this earlier, that a bicycle, for example, invites a certain way of using it. You don't take a nap on a bicycle, but you ride it. And it's the form itself kind of encourages its use in particular ways. And so I've been interested in identifying a number of different forms of the letter that enable it to be used in certain ways. And I want to talk about three today. One of those is materiality, that letters are a thing in the world. When I write a letter to you, you now can hold it in your hand and it exists. Letters also afford sociality. So letters are ways to communicate with one another, to connect with somebody else. And so letters, once we are used to encountering them, they facilitate sociality. And letters also have a fairly stereotypical structure. Usually when you write a letter, you begin, dear so-and-so, and then you have the content of the letter, and then you sign it, love so-and-so. Modern letters have a particular structure, and ancient letters had a particular structure too. And that structure is pronounced and stereotyped, and it enables certain uses and it produces certain effects. So I've taken this idea of affordances and these three affordances, materiality, or these three forms rather, materiality, sociality, and structure, and tested how these appear in Philostratus's life of Apollonius. Letters are a pretty important and central feature of this life of Apollonius. Apollonius is said to be a letter writer, and Philostratus describes letters. He quotes letters that Apollonius wrote, and he also paraphrases letters. And so letters are a consistent part of the narrative. And by tracing the roles of the letters in Philostratus's biography of Apollonius and paying attention to how these formal elements are used in the letter, we can collectively illustrate the affordances of epistolarity, in particular how they are useful in Philostratus's narrative to make Apollonius into the type of character that he wants Apollonius to be, namely a philosopher. They contribute particular things to this image of Apollonius as a philosopher. So materiality, the letter as a material thing, allows Philostratus to use letters and letter collections as a source. So in the introduction of his biography, he says, all these people have written about Apollonius in these certain ways, but their depiction is wrong. I, however, have gone throughout the world and I've collected Apollonius's letters, and now I have better insight than other people do into Apollonius's character, and I'm going to use them in the narrative. Philostratus then becomes, by using the letters in this way, he becomes an informed narrator. And so we, as the reader, become more convinced that we should listen to Philostratus's depiction of Apollonius. Philostratus then not only uses letters and their materiality as a source, but he also embeds them into the narrative. And so that leads to the two other formal dimensions that afford certain uses. So in terms of sociality, Philostratus embeds these letters into the narrative world and allows him to represent relationships. So when Apollonius writes letters, he writes letters to certain people, and the letters allow him to be in conversation with certain types of people. Especially, he engages in epistolary dialogue with other philosophers. And so as you read the story and you start paying attention to the types of people that Apollonius writes letters to, you notice that, well, he always writes letters to other philosophers, and he becomes then part of this cast of philosophers in the ancient world. He is one man among this sort of host of philosophers, and actually is depicted as being better than. And then also the structure of letters. Dear so-and-so. One of the things about letters is that when I write a letter, it's my voice that is coming through. And so when Philostratus quotes a letter, Apollonius is now allowed to speak for himself. This isn't Philostratus, or when Philostratus isn't the one depicting him in a certain way, the reader starts to believe that this is how Apollonius wants himself to be depicted. So when Apollonius writes letters, he says philosophical type things. And he also engages in a type of speech that is associated with philosophy in the ancient world. And that is this idea of Greek concept of parrhesia, or frankness. And so one interesting example to me is that Apollonius engages in these short letters with the Emperor Vespasian and gives him these short, pithy instructions about how to be a good emperor. And in the manner in which he writes, through his voice, Apollonius appears now as a philosophic type person. So when we read Philostratus' narrative and we pay attention to these formal elements, we start to see how they have afforded certain ways of depicting Apollonius, ways that make him out to be a philosopher. And he does this, I think, especially using these two forms of sociality and structure in a way that he closely links epistolarity itself, letter writing itself, with what it means to be a philosopher. Philosophers are the types of people who write letters. And so in writing letters, Apollonius has now become a philosopher. An interesting evidence of the success of Philostratus's narrative, I think, comes in a quote that is at the bottom of your handout. This is from actually a relative of Philostratus, of Lemnos, and he writes a book about letters, and he says, "Those who, next to the ancients, seem to me to have used epistolary style best are, of the philosophers, Apollonius of Tyana and Dio." And so with this quotation, we start to see that Apollonius has now been inextricably linked to both philosophy and letter writing. Those two things are combined. So in Philostratus' story, letters are not the only component of Apollonius's reputational construction, but they nevertheless play an important role in the politics of commemoration that Philostratus is engaged in. And based on this research that I've done with Philostratus's depiction of Apollonius, I'm going to be interested going forward in teasing out other places where epistolarity and the use and construction of letters and letter writing is an important piece of altering and commemorating religious figures in certain ways. So, thank you.